Hi, boys and girls. I recorded this earlier on YouTube live streaming, but then it wouldn't convert to a video, so I'm going to do it again. So if you've already read chapters 1 and 2, Trumpet of the Swan with me, you don't have to watch this again. Okay? So we are going to start Trumpet of the Swan. Trumpet of the Swan is written by E.B. White. E.B. White's the same author that wrote Charlotte's Web. And so I think you're really going to enjoy this book. There's a bit of a glare, isn't there? I think you're really going to enjoy this book. It's got a familiar writing style, and as we're reading, you're going to learn a lot about swans. Walking back to camp through the swamp, Sam wondered whether to tell his father what he had seen. I know one thing, he said to himself. I'm going back to that little pond again tomorrow, and I'd like to go alone. If I tell my father what I saw today, he would want to go with me, and I'm not sure that's a very good idea. Sam was 11. His last name was Beaver. He was strong for his age and had black hair and dark eyes like an Indian. Sam walked like an Indian, too, putting one foot straight in front of the other and making very little noise. The swamp through which he was traveling was a wild place. There was no trail, and it was boggy underfoot, which made walking difficult. Every 4 or 5 minutes, Sam took his compass out of his pocket and checked his course to make sure he was headed in a westerly direction. Canada's a big place. Much of it is wilderness. To get lost in the woods and swamps of western Canada would be a serious matter. As he trudged on, the boy's mind was full of the wonder of what he had seen. Not many people in the world had seen the nest of a trumpeter swan. Sam had found one on the lonely pond on this day in spring. He had seen 2 great white birds with their long white necks and black bills. There's a trumpeter. They do have a black bill, and they're very, very big, boys and girls. Nothing he had ever seen in all his life made him feel quite the way he felt on that little wild pond in the presence of those 2 enormous swans. They were so much bigger than any bird he'd ever seen before. The nest was big, too, a mound of sticks and grasses. The female was sitting on eggs. The male glided slowly back and forth, guarding her. When Sam reached camp, tired and hungry, he found his father frying a couple of fish for lunch. Where have you been? Asked Mr. Beaver. Exploring, replied Sam. I walked over to a pond about a half a mile from here. It's the one we see in the air as we're coming in. It isn't much of a place, nowhere near as big as this lake that we're on. Did you see anything over there? Asked his father. Well, said Sam, it's a swampy pond with a lot of reeds and cattails, and I don't think it'd be any good for fishing. And it's hard to get to. You have to cross the swamp. I can hear my kids coming down. So here's a picture, kiddos. The tall grasses are reeds, and the tall grasses with those thick things on them that look like a cat's tail, tall, thick, fuzzy pieces on the end, those are called cattails. And that's Sam walking from the edge of the pond through the swampy area, kiddos. Get my place back again. Did you see anything? Repeated Mr. Beaver. I saw a muskrat, said Sam, and a few red-winged blackbirds. Now, boys and girls, we have red-winged blackbirds in Illinois. Red-winged blackbirds are the little blackbirds, and they just have a little slice of red on their wings. They're beautiful, and they live in the long grass on either side of our roads. Mr. Beaver looked up from the wood stove where the fish were sizzling in a pan. Sam, he said, I know you like to go exploring, but don't forget, those woods and marshes are not like the country around home in Montana. If you ever go over to that pond, be careful you don't get lost. I don't like you crossing swamps. They're treacherous. You could step into a soggy place and get bogged down, and there wouldn't be anybody to pull you out. I'll be careful, said Sam. He knew perfectly well he was going back to the pond where the swans were, and he had no intentions of getting lost in the woods. He felt relieved that he had not told his father about seeing the swans, but he felt queer about it too. Sam was not a sly boy, but he was odd in one respect. He liked to keep things to himself, and he liked being alone, particularly when he was in the woods. He enjoyed the life on his father's cattle ranch in the sweetgrass country in Montana. He loved his mother. He loved Duke, his cow pony. He loved riding the range. He loved watching guests who came to board at the Beavers' ranch every summer. But the thing he enjoyed most in life was the camping trips in Canada with his father. Mrs. Beaver didn't care for the woods, so she seldom went along. It was usually just Sam and Mr. Beaver. They would motor to the border and cross into Canada. There, Mr. Beaver would hire a bush pilot to fly them to the lake where his camp was, for a few days of fishing and loafing and exploring. Mr. Beaver did most of the fishing and loafing. I'm assuming that doesn't mean that he's making bread loaves or eating bread loaves. I'm assuming that loafing means hanging out around the campsite, boys and girls. Sam did the exploring, and then the pilot would return to take them out. The pilot's name was Shorty. They would hear the sound of his motor and run out and wave and watch him glide down onto the lake and taxi his plane into the dock. Now, here's the camp, kiddos. As you're looking at the picture, there it is. As you're looking at the picture of the camp, I want you to think about an airplane. Usually airplanes land on wheels, and they land on runways at airports. This airplane had a pontoon. It was a pontoon plane. It had pontoons, or kind of these big, thick water skis that are almost the shape of a kayak. And those allowed the plane to land on water instead of landing on wheels. And also the pontoons kept the plane afloat so that it didn't sink like a normal plane would if it landed on the water. So that's pretty cool. It's a very unusual plane to see, and they're very beautiful. Now, boys and girls, the camping was the pleasantest days of Sam's life. These days in the woods, far, far from everywhere. No automobiles, no roads, no people, no noise, no school, no homework, no problems, except for the problem of getting lost. And, of course, the problem of what to be when he grew up. Every boy has that problem. After supper that evening, Sam and his father sat for a while on the porch. Sam was reading a bird book. "Pop," said Sam, "do you think we'll be coming back to camp about a month from now? I mean, in about 35 days or something like that?" "I guess so," replied Mr. Beaver. "I certainly hope so." "But why 35 days? What's so special about 35 days? "Oh, nothing," said Sam. "I just thought it might be very nice around here in 35 days. "That is the craziest thing I've ever heard of," said Mr. Beaver. "It's nice here all the time." Sam went indoors. He knew a lot about birds, and he knew it would take the Swan about 35 days to hatch her eggs. He hoped he could be at the pond to see the young ones when they came out of the eggs. So 35-day gestation period, or period inside the eggs before the baby swans were ready to come out. Sam kept a diary, a day book about his life. It was just a cheap notebook that was always by his bed. Every night before he turned in, he would write in the book. He wrote about the things he had done, things he had seen, and thoughts he had. Sometimes he drew a picture. He always ended by asking himself a question so he would have something to think about while falling asleep. On the day he found the swan's nest, this is what Sam wrote in his diary. "I saw a pair of trumpeter swans today on a small pond east of camp. The female had a nest with eggs in it. I saw 3, but I'm going to put 4 in the picture. I think she was laying another one. This is the greatest discovery I ever made in my entire life. I did not tell Pop. My bird book says baby swans are called cygnets. I'm going to go back tomorrow to visit the great swans again. I heard a fox bark today. Why does a fox bark? Is it because he's mad or worried or hungry, or because he is sending a message to another fox? Why does a fox bark?" Sam closed his notebook, undressed, crawled into his bunk, and lay there with his eyes closed, wondering why a fox barks. In a few minutes he was asleep, but I am left with the word cygnets. And I'd like to show it to you because I want you to see how you spell it. Cyggnets. There's the word cygnets. Cygnets is the word that we use to name baby swans. Everybody has different names for babies in groups of animals. For example, a group of owls is called a parliament, and a human's baby is called an infant, and a fox's baby is called a kit. Not a kid, but a kit. Baby swans are cygnets. So here we go with Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is called The Pond, and I think we're going to learn a little bit more in that chapter about the setting of our story. The pond Sam had discovered on that spring morning was seldom visited by any human being. All winter, snow had covered the ice. The pond lay cold and still under its white blanket. Most of the time there wasn't a sound to be heard. The frog was asleep. The chipmunk was asleep. Occasionally a jay would cry out, and sometimes at night the fox would bark, a high, rasping bark. Winter seemed to last forever. But one day a change came over the woods and the pond. Warm air, soft and kind, blew through the trees. The ice, which had softened during the night, began to melt. Now, boys and girls, Is the wind really soft and kind when it comes blowing sometimes? Or do you think that this author used a literary device to explain to us that instead of the wind being cold and freezing, that the wind maybe felt a little different? I'm thinking a little bit of personification. I'm also thinking that this author knows an awful lot about a pond in Canada. I wonder if this author had to actually do a little bit of research the way that we researched our biographies before we started writing our books, and had to learn that chipmunks and frogs and jays and foxes all live around ponds in Canada. I'm pretty sure that the author might not have known that unless they lived there, and it sounds like this is a pretty remote place that not a lot of people live. Well, anyway, here we go. The ice, which had softened during the night, began to melt. Patches of open water appeared. All the creatures that lived in the pond and in the woods were glad to feel the warmth. They heard and felt the breath of spring, and they stirred with new life and hope. There was a good new smell in the air, a smell of earth waking after its long sleep. Now, last Friday we had a snow, and after it snowed in the morning, I don't know if you smelled it, but if you stepped outside, all of a sudden the earth just smelled like dirt, because the dirt had been covered up by the ice and the snow, and then as the snow melted off, you could smell that dirt when the sun hit it and warmed it up. And boys and girls, it is a nice smell. It's the smell of the earth waking up. The frog, buried in the mud at the bottom of the pond, knew that spring was here. The chickadee knew and was delighted, but almost everything delights a chickadee. The vixen, dozing in her den, knew she would soon have kits. The vixen. I told you that a kit is a baby fox. So if a vixen is having a baby fox, that must mean that a vixen is the name for a female swan. Aren't we learning all sorts of interesting new words in this book? Every creature knew that a better, easier time was at hand. Warmer days, pleasanter nights. Trees were putting out green buds. The buds were swelling. Birds began arriving from the south. A pair of ducks flew in. The red-winged blackbird arrived and scouted the pond for nesting sites. A small sparrow with a white throat arrived and sang, "Oh, sweet Canada, Canada, Canada." Do you really think it said those words, or do you think the author just has heard its singing and thought that maybe that's what it sounded like to him? Kind of like when you look up in the sky at clouds and you imagine what shape they are. They're not just the shapes of clouds, they're the shapes of dragons or castles or horses or animals. I kind of think that's what the author was doing there. And if you had been sitting by the pond on that first warm day of spring, suddenly toward the end of that afternoon, you would have heard a stirring sound high above you in the air, a sound like the sound of trumpets. Ko-oh, ko-oh, and if you had looked up, you would have seen, high overhead, 2 great white birds. They flew swiftly, their legs stretched out straight behind, their long white necks stretched out ahead, their powerful wings beating steady and strong. Ko-oh, 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 a thrilling noise in the sky, the trumpeting of swans. Maybe that's the name of the story. Maybe that's where they got that name from. When the birds spotted the pond, they began circling, looking the place over from the air, and then they glided down and came to a rest on the water, folding their long wings neatly along their sides and turning their heads this way and that to discover and study their new surroundings. They were trumpeter swans, pure white birds with black bills. They had liked the looks of the swampy pond and decided to make it their home for a while and raise a family. The 2 swans were tired from the long flight. They were so glad to be down out of the sky. They paddled slowly about and then began feeding, thrusting their necks into the shallow water and pulling roots and plants from the bottom. Everything about these swans was white except for their bills and their feet, and those were black. They carried their heads high. The pond seemed a different place because of their arrival. And I want you to think about that. Sometimes your house seems like a different place after guests arrive, especially guests that haven't been there for a while. So the frog and the skunks and the fox and all of the animals that are used to being around the pond are used to each other. But when the swans came, who are not from there and have actually never been there before, I think that it made the big old pond seemed like a very different place because they were loud and different and new and special. And I want you to think about how that happens to you when guests arrive at your house too. Even in school, if there's a guest teacher or a speaker. For the next few days, the swans rested. When they grew hungry, they ate, and when they were thirsty, which was a great deal of the time, they drank. On the 10th day, the female began looking around to find a place to build her nest. Because I'm sure, as you have noticed in your backyards and in your neighborhoods and in your world, birds are looking for nesting places. Yep, in the spring of the year, nest building is uppermost in a bird's mind. It's the most important thing there is. If she picks a good place, she stands a good chance of hatching her eggs and rearing her young. If she picks a poor place, she may fail to raise a family. The female swan knew this, and she knew the decision she was making was extremely important. The two swans first investigated the upper end of the pond, where a stream flowed slowly in. It was pleasant there, with reeds and bulrushes. Now wait, we know that reeds, boys and girls, I think we're up here. We know that reeds are tall grasses on the side of a pond. So I'm assuming a bulrush probably has something to do with being a plant on the side of a pond as well. Red-winged blackbirds were busy nesting in this part of the pond, and a pair of mallard ducks were courting. Then the swans swam to the lower end of the pond, a marsh with woods on one side and a deer meadow on the other. It was lonely there. From one shore, a point of land extended out into the pond. It was a sandy strip like a little peninsula, and at the tip of it, a few feet under the water, was a tiny island hardly bigger than a dining room table. One small tree grew on the island, and there were rocks and ferns and grasses. I'm going to show you a picture of that little island. There it is, small, small, small. And then I'm going to show you a little map of peninsulas. Okay, kiddos, so I wanted to show you a map really quickly of some peninsulas. First of all, let's talk about the word peninsula. A peninsula is simply a landform that sticks out into the water and is only connected to land by one side. So take a look at Florida. Florida is connected to Georgia, and all the rest of it is surrounded by water, so it sticks out like a finger. Now I want you to take a look at Michigan, which is where I'm from. Michigan's in the shape of a mitten, and it's connected to Indiana and Ohio, and the rest of it is completely surrounded by water. And also there's the Upper Peninsula, which is also, it sticks off, and it's completely surrounded by water. Also, let's talk about, 3 sides. 3 or 4 sides. My son wanted me to tell you 3 or 4 sides are surrounded by water in a peninsula. That's the scientific 8th grade definition. So then let's talk about Montana. There's Montana, boys and girls, and that is where Sam Beaver's home is. But they drive up over the border, which as you can see is not a very far drive for them, and then they go into Canada, which is a lot bigger than that map. That map was sort of a close-up. So as you can see, there's the United States in green. They're driving up somewhere around there, and there's Canada. It's pink. Canada's huge, but they're not going too far north. They're staying down here in the lake area of Canada, which, according to my dad, brother, grandpa, and uncles, has really good fishing. So we'll take their word on that, and I guess I've eaten some good fish that's caught in Canada in those areas, just across the border from the United States. Lots of lakes. Well, boys and girls, when they looked at that island, the female said, "Take a look at this," and swam around and around that little island the size of a dining room table. "Go-oh," replied her husband, who liked to have someone ask his advice. The swan stepped cautiously out onto the island. The spot seemed made to order, just right for a nesting place. While the male swan floated close by, watching, she snooped around until she found a pleasant spot on the ground. She sat down to see how it felt to be sitting there. She decided it was the right size for her body. It was nicely located, a couple of feet from the water's edge, very convenient. She turned to her husband. "What do you think?" she asked. "An ideal location," he replied. "A perfect place. And I'll tell you why it's a perfect place," he continued majestically. "If an enemy, a fox or a coon, a coyote or a skunk, wanted to reach this spot with murder in his heart, he'd have to enter the water and get wet. And before he could enter the water, he'd have to walk the whole length of that point of land." Remember, it's a peninsula. "And by the time we'd see him or hear him, I would give him a hard time." The male stretched out his great wings, 8 feet from one tip to the other tip. 8 feet's pretty big, boys and girls. And gave the water a mighty clout to show his strength. This made him feel better right away. When a trumpeter swan hits an enemy with his wing, it's like being hit by a baseball bat. Now, how's that for a simile, boys and girls? If you get hit by a trumpeter swan with its wing, it's like being hit by a baseball bat. I've never been hit by a baseball bat, but I have hit a few balls with it, and I don't ever want to get hit by a baseball bat. I'm sure you would agree. A male swan, by the way, is called a cob. No one knows why, but that's what he's called. A good many animals have special names. A male goose is called a gander, a male cow is called a bull, a male sheep is called a ram, and a male chicken is called a rooster, and so on. Anyway, the thing to remember is that a male swan is called a cob, kind of like the corn cob that you eat, but it's got a multiple meaning to it. Now, I want to step back to the enemies of a baby swan. Not just a baby swan, but an egg. They said a fox or a raccoon or a coyote or a skunk if they wanted to reach the spot with murder in their heart. And what I believe that means is that if they wanted to reach the spot intending to eat those baby eggs. Boys and girls, what do you think? All right, let's keep going. The cob's wife pretended not to notice that her husband was showing off, but she saw it all right, and she was proud of his strength and his courage. As husbands go, he was a good one. The cob watched his beautiful wife sitting there on the tiny island, and to his great joy, he began to see her slowly turn round and round, keeping always in the same spot, treading the mud and grass. She was making the first motions of nesting. First she squatted down in the place she had chosen. Then she twisted round and around, tamping the earth with her broad-webbed feet, hollowing it out to make it like a saucer. Then she reached out and pulled twigs and grasses toward her and dropped them at her sides and under her tail, shaping the nest to her body. The cob floated close to his mate. He studied every move she made. "Now another medium stick, my love," he said. And she poked her splendid, long, white, graceful neck as far as it would go, picked up a stick, and placed it at her side. "Now another bit of coarse grass," said the cob with great dignity. The female reached for grasses, for moss, for twigs, anything that was handy. Slowly, carefully, she built up the nest until she was sitting on a big grassy mound. Goldie says hi. Can you turn around and say hi? She worked at this task for a couple of hours and then knocked off for the day, slid in the pond again to take a drink and have lunch. "A fine start," said the cob as he gazed back at the nest. "A perfect beginning. I don't know how you manage it so cleverly." "It comes naturally," replied his wife. "There's a lot of work to it, but on the whole it is pleasant work." "Yes," said the cob, "and when you're done, you have something to show for your trouble. You have a swan's nest 6 feet across. What other bird can say that?" "Well," said his wife, "maybe an eagle can say it." "Yes, but in that case, it wouldn't be a swan's nest, it would be an eagle's nest, and it would be high up in some old dead tree somewhere, instead of right down near the water, where all the conveniences that go with water." They both laughed at this. Then they began trumpeting and splashing and scooping up water and throwing it on their backs, darting about as though they had suddenly gone crazy with delight. "Ko-oh, ko-oh, ko-oh," they cried. Every wild creature within 1.5 miles of the pond heard the trumpeting of the swans. The fox heard, the raccoon heard, the skunk heard, and one pair of ears heard that did not belong to a wild creature. But the swans did not know that. I wonder what that one pair of ears belonged to, or who. Do you think it was Sam Beaver? Do you think it was somebody else? We'll have to stop there for the day. Thanks so much for tuning in for chapters 1 and 2. Have a great night.